Hey, man.
Thank you, go ahead. It's always better if I just stand closer and don't use the mic. Is everybody here okay? Everybody's good? Okay, if you change your mind, just let me know and I can either talk louder, which could be annoying, or, I'll get the mic. Okay, so to begin with, we're talking about the founding fathers. We're particularly focused on the ones that John Meacham covered, which is George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, John Adams, and Benjamin Franklin. Okay, so those are the main. There's others. There's another guy, Thomas Paine, who I'm not going to talk about, but he wrote this famous book called The Age of Reason, which you can read online now because it's way beyond copyright. Very interesting book, which is really an attack on Christendom. So because the founding fathers represented a lot of great classical education, I think probably all of them could read some Greek and Latin. I wanted to begin with a text that they would be very familiar with, a very famous book by Marcus Tullius Cicero, which is translated into English as How to Grow Old. And actually, I did a class on this quite a few years ago about sharing some of the wisdom. And here is just some of his wisdom that I think all of these founding fathers would have read in the course of their lifetime, though they probably would have read it in the original Latin. Sourness of disposition is never a virtue. As for miserliness in the old, what purpose it could serve, I don't understand. For what could be more ridiculous than for a traveler to add to his baggage at the end of a journey? Okay, that's that. And then a representative of the spirit of the founding fathers is one of my favorite theologians, a very not well known now, a guy named Samuel H. Miller, who I've mentioned several times before. During my ministry here, he was the dean of the chapel at Harvard University and an American Baptist pastor. But I've read fairly deeply into Samuel H. Miller, and I think he really does represent the best of the religion of the founding fathers. And here's one of his prayers, so let us pray. Our hearts, O God, seem less like growing things than like street corners where wind-blown rubbish and many strangers pass in the changing weather of the world. So deep root our affections in the beauty of thy grace, and we shall be as trees planted by the rivers of water. Strengthen us against every storm, and in due season bring forth our fruit in thy kingdom. Through Jesus Christ our Lord. Amen. Okay. So once again, my primary text for this lecture is John Meacham's book, American Gospel, God, the Founding Fathers, and the Making of a Nation. Really, I just used his first chapter, which covers the Founding Fathers, and then he goes on to talk about other things. But the thesis of this book really is how studying the Founding Fathers and studying how religion has been used in public life can perhaps help us come to a better, happier place with our own current discourse and divisiveness that we're now experiencing. So the Founding Fathers can be falsely used to support a Christian nation or a very secular nation. So there are both extremes that are used, and neither one are truly accurate. Sometimes they're also used to romanticize a past that really forgets all of the struggles with slavery, the horrible problems with the Native Americans, the subjugation of women and women's rights and women's issues and all of those things. And so we think back, it was a happier period, a better period, sort of like sometimes people do with the 1950s or after the Second World War. But really learning from them is more a way to understand how to cherish freedom and protect faith. And that was really what they were focused on, was cherishing freedom and protecting faith. And as you will see as I continue in the lecture, all faiths, not just all Christian denominations, but truly all world religions. America's early years were, like today, quite messy. Meacham says they were neither a golden age of religion or a glowing hour of enlightenment reason. So there's the two. There were the Great Awakening. There was Jonathan Edwards, the great American theologian. There were revivals, and there was a lot of religious fervor. There were problems with that religious fervor that I've also covered in some of my lectures previously about American church history. But neither was it a pinnacle of enlightenment reason where always wise decisions were made and both sides were considered. And it was of course just a messy situation, just like we have today. What they struggled was to assign religion its proper place in civil society. And Meacham thinks that they succeeded, a proper place in civil society. Okay. The other thing that I recommend to understand the feel and texture and beliefs of this period is a mini-series that was originally on HBO that you can now watch on Amazon Prime called John Adams. It's a 7-episode series that came out in 2008 with starring Paul Giamatti as John Adams. If you haven't seen that since 2008 or 9, I really highly recommend it. I think Giamatti did a masterful job, and it really takes him from the early years. It has these great scenes of what it was really like to live in the White House back when it was first being built, and oh my gosh, just all of those kind of things. In Jefferson's last letters, he wrote of America's hard-won freedom from monarchs who used church and state to reign over others, acting as though only kings could draw strength and standing from God. So while we're hearing about these founding fathers, Jefferson, Washington, Adams, Benjamin Franklin, we have to always remember that they were living at that time, which was very close to some of the terrible religious wars that were going on in Europe. And there was still lots of the European countries had monarchies. There were kings who were out of control. There were kings who were very either radically Protestant or radically Catholic. And there were just a lot of terrible things that were going on in the world. And they were determined that this new nation would not be drawn into that kind of thing. They all believed, Washington, Adams, Jefferson, Franklin, among others, they all believed that religion and all religions were beneficial to the moral good and the good of civil society in general. So they had this view that one might consider romanticized, that there was an essence of religion that was found in all religions, an ethical base, like we would say the golden rule. Treat others like you would like to be treated, something like that. And that those would come out in all world religions. That's the kind of thing that Mahatma Gandhi taught, for example. They used the term nature's God. And I think what they meant by that was not so much theology, doctrines, particularly as I mentioned last week, the Trinity was very suspect as something just invented by the church that only confused people, and that somehow in the natural world we might get a sense about the essence of God, maybe not the full nature of God, because sometimes nature can, of course, be extremely cruel. And so you might come up with some really wild and crazy ideas about God if you looked at nature from a certain angle. But that's how they used it. But they did believe in a benevolent creator, and they did believe in providence. And so let me just mention that briefly. So there was a form of religion that was very popular at that time called deism. But deism doesn't really believe in providence. Well, deism is usually described as God is the person who just got it all started and then steps back and watches what happens, maybe with great amusement. And that's very different from when the founding fathers said that God is the creator. There is a God who creates. They believed that there was a creator God and that this God ruled by providence, meaning simply that God was involved in shaping things that went on in the world. It wasn't just a deistic idea where things were put in place, like weather patterns just have their natural occurrences and things like that. So they didn't have all of the insights into science like we did, for sure. But they also believed that, of course, there were non-believers, perhaps someone like Thomas Paine, The Age of Reason, who could have been a better person, so to speak, than someone who was very Christian and believed that Jesus was their Lord and Savior, but really wasn't a very good person. And so they certainly believed in that. Of the four that I've mentioned, Adams was probably the most traditional church attender. He mainly went to the Unitarian Church, which at that time was still very Christian-based, unlike today where a lot of the Unitarians are more like world religion. It's a way for people who believe in the truth of all world religions to get together and find their essence. And some forms of Quakerism have become like that. But he also loved the liturgy of the Episcopal Church, and some of you may have grown up in the Episcopal Church, and you know there are a lot of people who just love the Book of Common Prayer and love the King James language that's in it, and he was one of those people who loved that. Franklin was probably the most curious and adventurous of all. He loved going to worship services of any kind he could go to. He would go to the Quakers, to the Presbyterians, the Methodists, the Baptists. He went to revivals. He just found the whole thing fascinating. How much of it he really believed, it's hard to say, but he loved attending these services. And the other thing I want to mention, to put things in context, is that most of society at that time was radically anti-Catholic, anti-Roman Catholic. And probably because there were still in Europe so many abuses. The church had, back from the time of the Reformation, of course, we're products of the Great Reformation and Calvinism and Lutheranism, but there were still so many practices of the Roman Catholic Church, which there are still today, that are so far from what they thought was the essence of the Bible. The churches, of course, were adorned in ways that people of Protestant faith found repulsive sometimes. They were very suspicious of the Pope and the power of the Pope and so forth. And also just remember that if you take the time to look at some of our creeds in our book of confessions, the Scots Confession, the larger catechism, the shorter catechism, the Heidelberg Catechism, they're all very radically anti-Roman Catholic. There's lots of very, put it to them, about the Roman Catholics and the abuses that the Roman Catholics had. And really it was a way to separate, like, this is what the Roman Catholics believe, we believe this. And a lot of it was in the form of a catechism where you say, the question is, where did the Roman Catholics have it wrong? The answer, here's what we believe is the right answer. And so there was a lot of that. Having said that, Franklin, he was an eclectic, open-minded guy. And he actually promoted the career of the first man who became a bishop in America. And so he was up for anything. The founding fathers were highly influenced by a mix of religion and philosophy. It became a sort of American religion. Okay, so they all read Plato, Aristotle, they read the great works of Cicero, of Plutarch's Lives. They knew Latin and Greek. They read all the classics, and they were influenced by Greek and Latin philosophy. They were influenced by the democratic political theories that were being promoted, primarily coming out of France and England at the time. They were influenced by deism, even though, as I said, they weren't, none of the four of them were really deists in the sense that they believed that God's hands were off of what was going on in the world. Primarily what they were focused on was the rights of humans and elevating the divinity of humanity, to say that God had put the spark of divinity into humans. And so, and of course, the famous lines from Jefferson that all men are created equal and endowed with inherent and inalienable rights. A religious vision of the world with roots both in classical philosophy and in Holy Scripture. Aristotle, Cicero, John Locke, who wrote this amazing book that I had to read in college. It's easy to read. It's an accessible book called The Reasonableness of Christianity. That book had a huge influence on them, and that book was published in the 1700s. Of course, there was messiness. The whole idea of the inalienable rights did not apply to women. It did not apply to slaves. Even voting, as you all know, for a long time was restricted to property owners. And it was only towards the end of the 1700s that a lot of states, Georgia, interestingly, was one of the first states, to remove the necessity of owning property as a voting allowance. Here's a quote I'm reading now from Meacham. What separated us from the old world was the idea that books, education, and the liberty to think and worship as we wished would create virtuous citizens who cherished and defended reason, faith, and freedom. In our finest hours, we have been neither wholly religious nor wholly secular, but have drawn from both traditions. So I think that's just really, really important. Think of, and some of you may have had this education, but think of what we understand as the classical education, or we might say today a liberal arts education. Many of you here had a liberal arts education, which made our parents nervous because it didn't really prepare us for a job right out of college. But somehow, it's all worked out for us. But think about that. Think about how a classical education was. You did learn the Greek and Latin classics. You may not have had to learn Greek and Latin, but you learned all these things. I had an education very much like that at the University of Virginia, and I'm very grateful for it. And having gone into the ministry, it turned out to be, I think, the right thing to focus on. It was a great focus for me. They were also influenced by some of the science that was coming out, of course, too. Jefferson, certainly a free thinker and a doubter, chose to have a traditional funeral conducted by an Episcopal pastor. And he wrote to Adams, "Once we left our sorrows and suffering bodies, we ascend in essence to an ecstatic meeting with the friends we have loved and lost, and whom we shall still love and never lose again." So he certainly believed in the life after death. He had lost his wife tragically at a very young age. He had lost one of his children. He was heartbroken by all those. The other thing I meant to mention, that there are still a few little small liberal arts colleges in the United States that focus on this classical education. And some of them are Roman Catholic, some of them are secular. But some of this influence of the classical education goes on today. The reading of great books, series, and things like that. I would say that on a personal note, this is something that has deeply influenced my life a lot. I remember at Princeton Seminary, I don't remember why this field, one of my professors did it, but he spent a whole class on Stoicism and the great Stoics, and probably of all of those classics, those are the ones I've read the most, Marcus Aurelius in particular, but there were others, Seneca, who was from Spain, and I thought, if I weren't a Christian, Stoicism, yes, I believe that. And of course, it's misunderstood as being Stoic. It has nothing to do with that. It's just a way of looking at life in a very practical, broad, reasonable way. And I think from classical education, what I had in college and on into seminary, and of course, mostly tons of reading I've done on my own. I feel like maybe one of the things I've tried to do with my life, and hopefully have succeeded, is to be open to inspiration, improvement, beauty, edification, courage, strength, and compassion from any source that's there, right? It doesn't have to just be the Bible. It can be films, it can be novels I'm reading, it can be a conversation with someone, a documentary, just any kind of thing. And of course, I haven't read deeply in the other religions, but we all are familiar with Judaism from our Old Testament and other forms too. And certainly there's some great things to learn from some of the Chinese philosophers, like in Taoism, Confucianism, and Buddhism, and things like that. But I've had the luxury and the leisure to pursue these things and the benefits of those 4 years at the University of Virginia. But I think what I've learned is that even among the learned, there is still this deep humanity of irrationality and fear and hypocrisy and blindness that's very powerful and dangerous. And it affected the founding fathers as it does us today, right? So they weren't perfect people. I mean, Jefferson, he knew that slavery was wrong. He wrote about how wrong slavery was, but he didn't want to give up his nice lifestyle. He didn't want to give up Monticello and all the wine that he was buying from France and his wine cellars and his beautiful gardens. And he even, remember, he got to the point where he thought that Monticello was just too much going on, and he built Poplar Forest down there outside of Lynchburg as a retreat, this beautiful little place that we can see today. So he was very much an elite. And we all know the story that he fathered at least one, if not many children with Sally Hemings, and he never freed her. She stayed a slave. He also, I don't necessarily consider this a moral failing, but he did also, because I've read a lot of those Alexander Dumas books about Jefferson in earlier years, he was in serious debt toward the end of his life, big time debt. And the only way he really cleared up his debt was, luckily, the Library of Congress agreed to buy his library toward the end of his life, which was worth a fortune. He was fluent reader in Spanish, French, Latin, Greek, Italian, I think too, and English. So he had all these books from all different languages. He had collected books, very expensive books, and he sold those and got enough money to pay off all of his debt. Pretty good. George Washington, David Hammer and I are in a book club together, and we read this book about how George Washington one of his slaves ran off, and he chased this woman all the way up into Pennsylvania, if not New England. He was incensed that his property had been stolen, and of course there were all these laws back then. Remember, David, do you remember the name of that law that provided people with they had to turn them in other words.
Yeah.
Yeah. But anyway, if you had a slave in Virginia and they got to Pennsylvania, which was a free state, the law of the nation said that you had to turn that person in because those guys in Virginia were going to be really upset and they wanted their property back. And so that was George Washington. Okay. But still, I think overall, these guys, and I'm sure their wives, their family, but it's all very men oriented, but we know there were excellent women at this time too. There was still a great nobility in these people. And they certainly, if we talked just a touch about, I used that term Christian nationalism last week about wanting to get back to a very specifically Christian country. And I did just hear this week that I think the governor of Oklahoma is requiring the teaching of the Bible in all of the public schools. People are upset about that. That's an example. The founding fathers would have definitely fought hard and long against anything like that. Here's a quote from them. A mantle of protection. There should be a mantle of protection for the Jew and the Gentile, the Christian and the Muhammad. They use a different word than we do for a Muslim. The Hindu and the infidel in every denomination. Jefferson, in fact, was known to have known that our nation was likely to grow ever more diverse. And of course, very much more diverse now than it was in his time. Here's another great quote from Nietzsche. Our finest hours, abolition of slavery, the expansion of the rights of women, fights against terror and tyranny, the battle against Jim Crow, can partly be traced to religious ideas about liberty, justice, and charity. Yet theology and scripture have also been used to justify our worst hours, from enslaving black people to persecuting Native Americans to treating women as second-class citizens. Meacham's belief is that looking to the founding fathers can help us now talking about God and politics without descending into discord and division. So I guess I would have to read the entire book, which I haven't gotten through yet, to really understand why he thinks that's true. But I think that here's an example, another quote from John Adams that gives you an idea about someone who, of course, was the second president of the United States, but had a lot of humility. He says, I hate polemical politics and polemical divinity. My religion is founded on the love of God and my neighbor, on the hope of pardon for my offenses, upon contrition, enduring with patience the inevitable evils of life, in the duty of doing no wrong, but all the good I can, to the creation of which I am but an infinitesimal part. So see, he had some humility. If you watch the John Adams, you'll be reminded that after he finished his political life, he had a very small, pretty humble farm up in Massachusetts, and he worked that farm. He wasn't like a gentleman farmer. He was out there doing all the work with his sons and other people that he could find to help him. So that kind of thing does seem to be missing, and we see representations of that on all sides of the spectrum, and the blue and the red, the liberal and the conservative. this kind of arrogance, this desire to win rather than to be clear or to be truthful. I believe the best of current Presbyterianism does embrace these. Of course, what we're up against is a lack of humility, the need to win, and now the ability to use false claims to promote causes, whatever they are. And I don't want to get into that rabbit hole, but you know what I'm talking about. Even the founding fathers were exceptional people who didn't necessarily represent the aspirations of the majority. So it's important also for us to not be naive and think, oh, everybody living in colonial America was like John Adams or Thomas Jefferson. I mean, these were exceptionally wealthy, privileged men who had leisure. They had, in the case of some of them, they had slaves to do a lot of their work for them. And they had time to do all kinds of other things. Jefferson's interest in designing gadgets and all the different things we learn about when we visit Monticello, to being real interested in architecture and all of those things that the average person wouldn't have had time to do. They're just out there hustling a living, working a farm, working a hard farm, trying barely making ends meet, and probably didn't necessarily have all those core values that I'm talking about. They may have been a lot like people today who had lots of prejudices, lots of hatred, felt threatened by immigrants coming in, all those kind of things we're dealing with now. And I always try to remind myself, and books have been written about this, but it's so true that sometimes we think that our values, our core values should be shared by everyone. And I think sometimes I have to remind myself that sometimes they're not. You know, I remember having a conversation with one of my nephews last year, and I was telling him about why I didn't respect a certain politician. And I realized from the look of his face that those reasons I was giving were not things that he valued. And these are the things that I would mention: balance, calm reason, respect for all people as God's children, self-reflection and examination of our flaws, generosity, compassion, virtues such as courage and honesty and integrity. Okay? A lot of people they're just up, they just want to win, right? It's a game. They want to win the game. They'll tell lies to promote their game, to win their game. And as I just listened to recently, the guy who's, I can't remember his last name, his first name is Ari, he's an intellectual from Israel. And he was talking about how most information is not truth. Information is easy to come by. You can make up anything. Truth is very difficult to come by. Truth requires hard work. It requires all of these things. It requires looking at both sides, doing like my friend David Hammer does. He likes to listen to all the different perspectives on the radio, right? I think that's a great idea. I think we all should do that. I think it's a brilliant thing for us all to do. Let's be open to hearing all the different sides of things, because somewhere there is the truth, and the truth takes great effort, and the truth can also be very painful, which is why we have all these fights too about what we teach our children, because so many parents don't want their children to know the truth. They don't want them to really know the whole story about slavery or what happened to the Native Americans. They just don't want them to know those things, but it's the truth. Okay, now I have one more quote. I'm about ready to wrap up. This is a great quote from Franklin, another example of someone's creed, okay, and with a little bit of humor in the end. I believe, this is Franklin, I believe in one God, creator of the universe, that he governs it by his providence. Once again, there's that. He governs, he's not just set aside. That he ought to be worshipped, that the most acceptable service we can render to him is doing good to his other children, that the soul of man is immortal and will be treated with justice in another life, respecting its conduct in this life. These I take to be the fundamental principles of all sound religion, and I regard them as you do in whatever sect I meet with them. As to Jesus of Nazareth, I think the system of morals and his religion, as he left them to us, the best the world ever saw or is likely to see. But I apprehend it has received various corrupting changes, and I have some doubts as to his divinity, though it is a question I do not dogmatize upon, having never studied it, and think it needless to busy myself with it now, when I expect soon an opportunity of knowing the truth with less trouble. I love that. So even if I'm about ready to die, I'll find it. And why that's a big argument. So that's so just to kind of wrap up a little bit here.
So I have a question.
Yeah, go ahead.
So the reason I was so interested in this topic was when I heard that the founding fathers believed strongly in the separation of church and state because they knew how much blood had been spilled over the land of.
Yes, and that's what I was mentioning earlier about the wars in Europe, and yes, I didn't make it as clear, but yes. So that's right. So the separation of church and state, or this what they called a public religion, or the belief in nature's God, was all the way to say we cannot become sectarian, like a Roman Catholic king who goes to war against the Scots who were Presbyterians, or whatever. That may not really happen, but whatever, whatever the example, anything more.
Well, I just think that was the main thought that I had, was that
they were trying to
they knew the dangers. They had seen it from history. They had seen when the leaders of the country or the kings were promoting their own religion.
Right.
All the wars, all the blood that had been spilled over the centuries because of that. Yes,
and you're right. I didn't emphasize that enough. Though they also believed that there was truth in all religions, and there was an essence, and there was something that they could call.
But look what it did.
Yeah.
If there was one religion.
If there was one religion, right. And there have been some examples of, I guess, societies like Scotland today. I think the Presbyterian Church is still the state religion. It's the pastors are paid for by taxes, but it's probably a pretty open society. So, but there's probably a lot of people who still don't like that too. I'd have to go deeper into some history, and I wasn't prepared to do that, but that could be another class for someone about what really happened in Europe and what all the horrible things that really happened. I know there was a lot of really, really bad things that happened during the life of Martin Luther, when these sectarian things broke, and various princes of Germany, before Germany became a unified country, and these princes would go to war over, and it was chaos, and all these peasants were slaughtered, and there was a lot of terrible things that happened, but that, of course, was back in the early 1500s.
Well, even watching the series on Henry VIII and the different wives who had different religions that they were trying to
blood in your.
Exactly. My point.
Yes. Okay. So that's good. Thank you. Okay. So I talked about they called it public religion, nature's God. Here's another thing that I think is interesting that Meacham brings up. Despite the efforts to amend the Constitution to include Jesus or Christian nation, he says, and he is a scholar of American history, no president across 3 centuries has made an even remotely serious attempt to do so. So there's something, even in all the different spectrums of conservative, liberal, anybody from Ronald Reagan to LBJ, whoever, nobody has actually tried to put Christian, no president, as he's saying. I mean, there were people who tried to do this, but no president has done it. Public religion for the fathers was not about our nation being special or having a divine destiny. It wasn't about our nation. It was about the divinity within the individual and personal virtues. And so I said that earlier, but I just wanted to repeat that. And this is another thing now about the Presbyterian, and I'll finish, and we can, if we have time, we'll do some questions or comments. Presbyterians, one of the hearts of Reformed theology coming from Calvinism and coming from Paul the Apostle, is that salvation is a gift. It's not something we earn. There's not a checklist or you have enough brownie points on one side or demerits on the other. But we also, I think, really believe, in essence, the essence of Presbyterianism is that personal integrity stands far above creeds and doctrines or even evangelical zeal. Okay? And we say that, though obviously millions think otherwise, right? And so to use a current example that Kate brought to my attention, this is kind of like my little parable. Better to live quietly with a simple, honest life, faithful to the golden rule, than to start a church that grows to the thousands and end up in a hotel room in Las Vegas with guns and drugs and police arrests. What happened to a Kernersville pastor, right? So I think in conclusion, the deeper understanding of the founding fathers and this idea of public religion and nature's God, that might be a really good fit for us right now. I know a lot of people wouldn't be comfortable with it because it's not focused enough on Jesus or the divinity of Jesus or salvation through Jesus. But I think it also could be something that could gain some consensus for us and help us. And I think as we look more deeply, I'm certainly got some other books on my shelves to read about the founding fathers, and I'll continue to do my research and studies. So. Okay, so I think it's 11:45. Maybe we've got a little bit of time if you might want to make a comment. I didn't cover the Jefferson Bible, but I think I covered it last week. Jim says he's got one at home, and that's where I told you last week he sat down at his study with a razor and got rid of everything he didn't believe in. And I think that's a good to look at. There's another one that was published by Stephen Mitchell where he kind of did his own thing. But I'm sure we have copies of it in the church library. And I think it would be an excellent thing to do, along with listening to all persuasions of political discourse like Cameron does. And read that and see if you agree. See if you think, yeah, I could go with the Jefferson Bible. Yeah, that'd be good. I think we could get some consensus on it. I haven't read it in a while, so I'll do the same. I'm sure it's available online too. Yeah.
The term deist is interesting because I remember in school being told that pretty much all the founding fathers were deists. That they really, that was kind of the fundamental, that they didn't think God was, stepping in and doing this, but they did believe. So is there a generic term of deism?
There must be, and that was a surprise to me too, but I'm just kind of trusting Vision on this, and he is giving direct quotes, even from Franklin, who said he believed that God rules by his providence, and that's the only thing that can mean. And unless I have deism wrong in some way, but there must be a different way of thinking about it that might just be called something like, it'd be like the Trinity is like, I really just believe in the Father. I believe in the Creator, or something like that.
Yeah. Well, some modern books I read is clockmaker's art.
Yeah.
You wound it up and let it go.
Right, well, that's what I was saying, but that was my understanding, but I can do a deeper dive on that and see if we got something wrong.
Didn't Jefferson believe that Jesus was not divine? And he compared him to, he's another prophet like Buddha, Muhammad.
Right, right, and that's what Franklin said in that quote, he said, I doubt his divinity. But they did believe, and of course, the thing that I could hear a Christian theologian saying today, that Jesus didn't really, his primary message was really not about creating a moral platform. I mean, that was, I mean, he was coming as the Messiah. He was coming to usher in, there was all kinds of other trails you could go through about what Jesus' life was really like. Yes, we do have the Sermon on the Mount and other things that he said about sit at the end of the table, don't always sit at the front, turn the other cheek, eat without sin, cast the first stone, all those great things. And I think those are the things he's talking about. But I think for Franklin to say that the moral message he created was just anecdotal with his teaching. It wasn't systematic, I would say that. Okay. All right.